want to take an opportunity to talk a little bit about NetWare services and why migrating the older NetWare platforms and the services that are on those platforms to Open Enterprise Server 2 is not as a daunting a task or problematic as many might think. So initially, when NetWare was created, NetWare was a very tightly coupled operating system. It basically was the first instance of a network operating system that was not dependent on a mainframe. It worked very well in terms of being able to service up file and print, and that's what it started out with. In fact, when we think about NetWare, NetWare actually ran on commodity hardware, and that was one of the advantages of it. It was inexpensive to be able to run it, although not the cheapest thing in the world. It was actually a very cost-effective solution. But we talk about NetWare, we talk about the services. So the thing was that NetWare itself actually had this little kernel inside of it. This kernel was actually what handled all the communications between the hardware and the operating system. So everything down to the wire and up to the operating system was handled by this kernel. Now, NetWare was known initially for file, and it was also known for print. We also had the ability to add, at times, database services with functions like btrieve. The early versions of NetWare were plagued by the problem that you had to develop to VAPs, or things had to be specifically configured or programmed to a complicated language. Even NLMs were a little difficult. But we did begin to introduce things like directory services. And when you get right down to it, the real value that most people see in NetWare is the services section. This part is what's the most important part. And these services are the kinds of services that are delivered through the version 6 of NetWare. In fact, through version 6, we might refer to all these services as the NetWare services stack specifically. Now, as we moved forward, we began to realize that what we needed to do was take these services and begin to decouple them from the NetWare kernel. The kernel was important, but the services were the valuable part. We didn't have a good alternative. We didn't have an alternative to the NetWare kernel really that was satisfactory to us. But what we wanted to begin to do was build a separation of the services from the kernel itself. So this space was a way of beginning to migrate for that. So this forward-looking vision was really important. We'd call this what we deliver through version 6.5. Nice capabilities here, really good to be able to do this, but obviously we're still dependent on the NetWare kernel, and we're still sitting on top of a 32-bit platform. Now, as we move forward, we began to say, okay, what can we do? What kernel can we introduce now? Looked at different things, but what really made most sense is we began to look at the ability of introducing, in addition to the NetWare kernel, a Linux kernel. The Linux kernel was important because it was an up-and-coming open source standard, really valuable because it wasn't tied to a given manufacturer, wasn't controlled. It embraced open source and open standards, which Novell's always done. So now we would refer to this implementation of NetWare services stack on top of a NetWare kernel and a Linux kernel as OES1. Great platform, good step forward. We needed to continue to move on that. So what we started doing is building a new version, or beginning to change the way we looked at that. So we shifted some of the priorities. The NetWare kernel is still in place, a little bit more Linux focused. Now we would call this Open Enterprise Server 2. Same services. In fact, in this point, we were beginning to move more and more of the services that were truly dependent on the NetWare kernel to being capable of being deployed on the Linux kernel. That's a cool part of this. Now, we keep going forward, and the next big improvement here is, in addition to being able providing these different kernels underneath, we now open the opportunity to build these services on top of a 64-bit platform, something we could never do in the NetWare kernel space. Now we've got this services stack that sits on the NetWare kernel, sits on the Linux kernel, 32-bit or 64-bit, depending on how you want to deploy that. And we've also extended the ability to deploy things like SAP and Oracle and other applications that will run on a Linux kernel but not a NetWare kernel, and now you can begin to integrate those things. The nice thing about it is these services are now exposed and independent services that can be deployed as you need them throughout your network.